and welcome to My So-Called Disabled Life. My name is Chaundra McGill, your host. I am a motivational speaker and a certified life coach for the disabled. I am so thrilled to have our guest today, Dr. Arielle Silverman. She is the Director of Research at the American Foundation for the Blind, and she's also an author of a book called Just Human: The Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for doing this interview. Really appreciate you. Now, the majority of our interviewees, not all of them, but the majority have a disability. Do you have a disability?
Yes, I have been blind since birth.
Okay, you've been blind since birth. Now, is there a particular reason why?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with a genetic condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis, or LCA. I have not had genetic screening, so I don't know which variation of that condition I have, but that I was diagnosed based on just clinical criteria when I was a baby. So I've had stable light perception, so I can see light and shadow, but I've never had any usable vision beyond that.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you for sharing. Now, what is your professional experience, particularly as a social psychologist?
So I actually started off as a biology major, but I was interested in kind of like the human, the interface between humans and medicine and humans and science. And like bioethical issues around emerging biotechnologies and things like that. But as I started college, I became a lot more interested in understanding and remediating barriers related to prejudice and stereotyping against people with disabilities, especially people who are blind. So I decided to add a second major in psychology and eventually to go into social psychology so that I could really dive deep into current understanding and scientific understandings of where prejudice and stereotypes come from and how they can be reduced. So I got my doctorate in social psychology from the University of Colorado Boulder 8 years ago. And then I did a postdoc, which is like a 2-year research fellowship in a rehabilitation psychology department at the University of Washington. So I learned about other types of disabilities like physical disabilities, multiple sclerosis, and muscular dystrophy and things like that, and kind of how people react psychologically to having those types of disabilities. And then from there, I decided to go off on my own and do some consulting work. So I did a combination of research consulting where I would help groups, university institutes and groups like that with conducting their research. I also did some trainings on inclusion for different types of organizations who were trying to figure out how to become more inclusive in their workforce or in the services that they provided. And then one of my consulting clients ended up being the American Foundation for the Blind. And when a job opened up in their research department, I decided to go ahead and start working for them full time. I've also worked part-time for several years for a pre-employment program for blind and low vision teens in Virginia. So I was doing that for a while, and I learned a lot about, transition to employment kinds of issues in that population. And then today I work as the Director of Research at the American Foundation for the Blind. So I head up their research department, conducting surveys and focus groups and interviews to learn about the barriers and solutions for people who are blind and have low vision.
Wow, all of that is very impressive. Now, along that road, I know as a blind woman, you've had to endure your own barriers, prejudices, and stereotypes. What have you endured?
So I think in a lot of ways, and this comes up in my book, and in a lot of ways, I've been very fortunate that I've had several excellent mentors who have encouraged me to do whatever I wanted to do professionally and personally, and not, didn't factor the disability in as a negative. For the most part, I've had course materials that were accessible. I mean, sometimes I had to be a little creative in how to access the materials. I would say occasionally there were situations where people like had questions or weren't quite sure how I would perform certain tasks. Like the one thing that comes to mind is teaching. When I was a graduate student, all graduate students have teaching assignments where they assist in the classroom. And there was some doubt about how well I could be a teaching assistant, especially in certain subjects like statistics. And so I had to advocate for myself a little bit to explain that not only am I capable of being a teaching assistant, but I actually want to do that because I want to get the experience and learn, in case I do decide to become a professor, learn how to do the teaching. So there were sometimes situations like that where I had to advocate for myself. But I think because I've worked in the disability field and I've also had a lot of control over, especially when I was self-employed, I had a lot of control over the types of people that I worked for and with, and the types of equipment that I used. So I haven't had a lot of the barriers that many of my peers who are blind or have low vision face in the workplace. Okay. And then I would say, like, personally, I mean, of course, like sometimes I run into people who have prejudices and, you know, will talk to me like I'm a child, or they'll grab me and try to manhandle me and steer me places and things like that.
Wow, really?
And sometimes that can be almost harder because it is what you would call microaggressions. It's like these little things that happen a lot, and so they can add up over time. And the hardest thing about microaggressions is that the person who's doing it is usually trying to be nice. And so it's really hard to like stand up for yourself because you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings if they're trying to be nice.
Right.
But at the same time, like, it's not fun to be grabbed and pulled or talked to like a child. So figuring out how to deal with that can be tricky sometimes.
I bet. Wow. That's quite an experience. Now let's go jump into your book. What was your motivation for writing your book?
So when I was doing my consulting work, I was really thinking a lot about what I thought inclusion should look like and what I thought people who don't have disabilities should know about what it's like to have a disability and how to be inclusive. And I kept going back to these like childhood experiences and moments in my mind that stuck around in my memory that were really influential on my thinking about inclusion. And so I started writing these individual essays, and each one was kind of like sharing what happened in this childhood experience, but it was also sharing the lessons that I learned from the experience or that I wanted another person to learn from reading about the experience. And so I wrote these individual essays, kind of vaguely thinking maybe someday I would put them all into a book. And then when the pandemic started, I had, of course, a lot more time. And I also started thinking a lot more about, of course, like, life is short and who knows where we're going to be in 5 years, and these are things that I really want to leave behind. These lessons that I learned as a child and the lessons that I've learned recently as an adult are things that I want to leave behind. So that really motivated me in 2020 to get going on writing all the stories down and then putting them together into a coherent frame.
Okay. When you were talking about lessons as a child and lessons as an adult, give me one example of a really powerful lesson you learned as a child.
So the first chapter that I wrote is actually chapter 5. And there's a couple of incidents from my childhood that I catalog in chapter 5. And specifically, these are things that happened when I was in 4th grade, during the first half of 4th grade, which is the time that I kind of pinpoint as when I started to become aware of the fact that I was different from everyone else around me and that people reacted negatively to the fact that I was different. So there was, for example, an experience where I was getting on the school bus with my friends, and there was a new bus driver, and this new bus driver had this idea that I needed to sit in the very front seat, like right behind him or across from him, because of my disability. And because of that, I was separated from my friends, and I was put in a place that was socially stigmatized because I was like sitting all the way up front with the little kids on the bus. And so that experience really taught me that I was a target of discrimination, that sometimes people made assumptions about me. Like, this bus driver had never met me before, knew nothing about me. All that he knew is that I carried a white cane when I boarded the bus. And based on that, he made assumptions about that I needed to be protected, or I think he misinterpreted some policies that he had been trained or maybe not well trained on. So I learned from that people make assumptions. And it really got me thinking about what I wanted people to do when they interact with me, which is not to make assumptions, but to actually look beyond that first impression of seeing my cane and actually see me as an individual.
Right. You speak a lot about that in your book. Now, one question I do want to ask, and I know that who are you advocating for in this book? Because you talk a lot about race, socioeconomics, politics, but of course, disability. What compelled you to put all of those into your book?
Well, I mean, disability is definitely the focus, of course, but there are issues that have relevance to other minority groups as well. And I think a lot of the response that I'm asking people to consider making when they read my book is to think about things in ways that could benefit other groups as well. And so there's parallels between some of the discrimination, and of course it's not the same, but there are some parallels between some of the discrimination faced by people with disabilities and some of the patterns of discrimination faced by other minority groups. And I think also when we look at disability justice, it makes us think a little bit differently about economic and political systems, and how they operate, and how we can intervene to make them more fair and just for everyone.
Yes, great. Well, we are out of time right now, but please join us next time as we finish our interview with Dr. Silverman. Thank you for joining, and don't forget to subscribe to the My So-Called Disabled Life YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you know when the shows come on.